Bienvenue à tous, merci de votre participation. Pour écouter notre session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français. Merci.
On behalf of ICLEI Africa, the African Center for Cities, Our Future Cities, Surge Africa, and the Red Cross Crescent Climate Center, we are delighted to welcome you to the Rise Africa 2024 Action Festival. Rise Africa is a platform that brings together thinkers, doers, and enablers to inspire action for sustainable cities. This is our 4th edition of our Rise Africa Action Festival, which brings together insights, practices, and visions from across the continent under this year's theme of Solutions Only, Failures Also. This year's theme provokes us to change the way we view our cities and approach their development, particularly to promote a solutions orientation to our worldview. The festival invites you to embrace different ways of knowing, to seek ways to bridge science, policy, business, and arts in creative ways. It invites you to forge new partnerships, experiment with new concepts and ideas, and drive change in your homes and communities. This year's festival, we are running a social media storm to share how urbanization is happening in Africa, that cities can be centers of possibility, and how we can inspire action for sustainable African cities. Please share these for the days of the festival, including Africa Day, the 25th of May. As is tradition, we invite you to enter this session in a spirit of creativity.
Hello, my name is Gesha Aletta, and my poem is titled, How Can We Be Afraid of the Light? The hour before dawn rouses the birds. They sing their excitement for the light. We toss and turn beneath our covers. We choose sleeping rather than sight. Without resting, there can be no labor. We need the darkness for a season. When the time comes to turn the light on, we're beside ourselves with reasons. Why we can't turn off the beaten path. Why what it asks is maybe decades or centuries away. Why it's too great to bear the burden that change asks. Why the fire and the light are dangerous because of the trails they blaze. He said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. We want change to seduce us boldly, but only with the lights off. How can we be afraid of the light? How can we hide from the glistening of tears? How can we abandon our efforts and failures? How can we be corralled by our fears? How can we be afraid of the light? How can we shy away from smiling with all our teeth? Why don't we bind our wounds with laughter's balm? How dare we bury our humanity beneath? There's a beating heart in every chest, and it's longing for a chance to run towards the finish line, whether it comes first or last. Hearts aren't swayed by competition to cease beating because of the chorus of other beating hearts. When did we become renegades towards this intuition? Perhaps if we stop trying to conquer, colonize, destroy, dominate, is where winning starts.
Hello, welcome. Welcome to the 3rd day and final day of our Rise Africa Action Festival. My name is Vida. I am the Rise Africa Action Festival curator and coordinator, and I've had the honor of holding that role alongside the incredible Rise and broader ICLEI team. We've been through a whirlwind of 3 days where we have unpacked solutions only, failures also. We've gone deep into what it actually means to orient ourselves to solutions. On our first day, we were able to be exposed to some incredible on-the-ground work that Africans are doing to offer solutions to spaces. And we contemplated them, we reflected on them, and we gained insight from them. And most importantly, we were inspired by them. Our second day took us through failures and took us through the fear of failure, where we reconciled with what does it actually mean to feel failure and feel it fully, how we use it, how we
grow with it and how we learn to do better from it. So that kind of brings us to our day 3, which is this liminal in-between space that looks at solutions exist and we must look at and advocate for our solutions. Failures exist and we must acknowledge our failures. But how do we make space for both of these things? And that takes us to reflection. So with reflection, it can go quite broad, but essentially what it comes down to is capacity building and creating space for you to engage in learning and deepening how we learn. So we're going to have to settle with this in between period and this period of reflection and think about what that means and what it means to cultivate an environment for learning about our past while we engage in our present, because in order to reflect, we must be present. So joining me for today, we'll have my colleague Zakia Atkins, and I'll have my colleague Mimbo Changula, who run us through the session. And we'll be having conversations with cross-disciplinary thinkers and experts who are going to unpack this theme of reflection with us. Rosie Downey is a sleuth for stories, as she has described herself, and a weaver of networks. Professor Yusang Maria Asim is a children's rights and human rights lawyer and researcher. Sikle Motsa is a gender and sexuality researcher and advocate for gender sexuality rights and the visibility of Black and queer female bodies on the continent. And to kind of hold us all in this space is Nora Zorali Aniodu, who will take us through a storytelling intervention. So thank you to all the participants who have joined us today and who will be taking us through this conversation and who will be holding space while we do this. So in the spirit of today's theme, I want everybody to settle in. For us to start off by closing your eyes. I can't see everybody's face, so I'm just going to trust in good faith that your eyes are closed. And I want you to think about the word reflection. And while you're thinking about the word reflection, I want to take a deep breath in for 4, 3, 2, 1, and then hold it there for 4, 3, 2, 1, and release for 4, 3, 2, 1. So while you contemplated on just the word reflection, I also want you to think about any feelings that came up, any discomfort that you might have felt, any comfort or excitement or jitters or confusion. Contemplate the feelings that you had while you thought of the word reflection, what it means to you after coming off of this festival, and keep that feeling in mind and keep those insights in mind as Zakia leads us through our Mentimeter, our next exercise.
Sure. I'll kindly be pasting the link to the Mentimeter in the chat, as well as the code to the Mentimeter before I start sharing my screen. Okay, sure. Okay. So if you can all see my screen, I'll begin now. So I pasted the Mentimeter code and link in the chat. On your mobile phone or web browser, please go to menti.com if you have not already and type in the code 82987728. That is 82987728. The number is also should also display on the screen if you don't have it already. Alternatively, you could also click the link in the chat. So the first question is, what does reflection mean to you? I'm currently seeing responses come up such as breath, space, pause, consider, think, learning, time. All really interesting answers. Thank you. I think just waiting a few more minutes or seconds so that everyone could also join this as well. You also have the ability to provide more than one answer. So if you have any more, please go ahead. Thanks. I think we're getting different perspectives, synthesis, reinventing as responses to this, with space and learning coming up as like the main answers. Okay, yeah. I think we can move on to the next question.
Okay, thank you, Zakia.
So the next question would be, what are some of the biases or blind spots that limit reflection? This is a short response, so please, if you could provide your answers. I encourage you to answer this question because it provides a great foundation to today's discussion. It encourages self-awareness, introspection, and fosters deeper reflection on one's perspective and thought processes. I think we can just wait a few more seconds so that we could get some answers. Yeah. So far we have a ego can limit reflection. Of not wanting to appear to have failed. Yeah. I think we can just wait a few more seconds. Okay, we got crowded mind and then also not enough time in the day. Clinging to preconceived ideal visions of ourselves that we feel the need to live up to. These are very, very good responses. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so thank you everyone for providing these really, really good reflections. I'll now hand over to Vida. Thanks.
Thank you, Zakia. So the whole point of this beginning and this exercise is to have us think about what we understand as reflection and to have us think about the biases we might have around reflection. Because if reflection is this thing that's creating space, why don't we do it enough? And do we do it enough? So thank you for participating. Thank you for sharing your insights. The theme for today's, or the title for today's discussion is Reflection, Nurturing Spaces for Deepening African Urban Practice, which is quite expansive. And there's a lot of things that we can use to branch off there. But in the beginning, there's a bit of a paradox because reflection requires stillness and practice requires action. So we're grappling the space between needing to be still and needing to have action. So as we've learned from countless sessions throughout the festival, the power of making sustainable change lies in being intentional and how we are intentional, from how we think about things to the words we use to how we plan and how we plan to organize people and how we plan to organize people and think with people. It all comes down to intentionality. And just like we need to be intentional about showing off solutions and intentional about how we observe our failures, we must also be intentional with how we bring ourselves to a point of reflection. So all we're really doing is thinking about how do we create capacity? How do we deepen capacity to learn? And one of the other points that we've been talking through a lot is that need for paradigm shift. So if we think about what does reflection have to offer us with paradigm shifts, what that comes down to is how do we make movements over small distances and big distances to break the patterns that we have fallen into when we think about our cities and when we think about how we reflect on our cities. So when we look back at the way the words that we've used or the tones that we've used, not necessarily during this festival alone, but in our private lives, in our social spaces, amongst our colleagues and amongst our lived environments, how are we reflecting on our cities and what are the spaces that need to shift there? So that's where our panelists are going to be quite incredible taking us through. So common things that we've heard is that our cities are poor or that our cities are failing and that our cities are in crisis. And while this is not completely untrue, it's not the complete truth either. It's a thinking pattern. So reflection is a deliberate space that requires us to slow down long enough to be present and observe the solutions and successes and also our failures and shortcomings and where we glean insight for growth. So here I'll invite our first discussant, Rosie Downey, who will help us think about what it means to reflect and enliven space for reflection when working with multi-stakeholder networks that often further intersect at multiple disciplinary points. So what does it mean to bring such a wide array of threads into one moment of stillness and have that to deepen the capacity for collective learning? So Rosie, love to welcome you to maybe introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself further.
Hi, everyone. So Rosie Downey. I'm dialing in from Cape Town in South Africa. When I started the work that I do, it's not something that I could have studied, and it took a very long time to articulate actually what it was. But really, it started when I was working with global research networks, and I found that there was actually a need to support them to collaborate more effectively, to authentically connect with each other, particularly in an increasingly globalized world, in a remote world, and to better communicate with each other. So I started a consultancy called Digital Weavers to do these three things. And today I'm going to be reflecting on some of the key parts that I've needed to learn in terms of how do you weave very diverse individuals and networks together when they're working towards a common goal.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. And actually, that's a great introduction to yourself, as well as, I guess, setting the tone for that first question. How do you actually bring together many ways of making sustainable? So the act of how we start thinking, physically making sustainable impact, and many ways of thinking about making sustainable impact into one moment of reflection. So how do you negotiate everybody's differences and everybody's ways of approach with the same common goal, but bring them down into this one place of reflection?
So really, by nature, any organization or group of people who are working towards systems change, they're usually transdisciplinary, working across many different fields. They're usually multi-stakeholder, so they might have academics or researchers or practitioners, and that in turn means it's intensely collaborative. And if you're going to collaborate, it's so important to constantly check in with asking yourselves, what's the vision we're trying to achieve? How are we going about achieving that? And what's the learning that's actually happening between everyone? And really, this collaboration is essential if you are going to work at a network level. And I guess the large research networks I've worked with are pretty characteristic of most of them that are around the world. So they're generally global north, global south partners. So you can imagine the power dynamics that come up in that. They're usually, as I mentioned, transdisciplinary. So you might have soil scientists or farmers working with architects or urbanists or gender specialists. So they're very, very diverse. And then in terms of the kind of multi-stakeholder, they've got very different agendas of why they're doing something. So you might have a government working in policy, an academic who's more around the theory, and then practitioners who are very interested in just the practicalities of what they're going about. So that huge diversity of voices, perspectives, cultures, languages, it brings up a lot of challenges. And I know that you have a couple of other questions for me about challenges. But it's weaving this together, the practice of that can be what I often see as really having two parts. And the first part is reflecting at an individual level, and the second part is reflecting at a network level. But really the magic starts, and it really has to begin with this, is at the individual level. And I like to use the turn of phrase, which is stirring the pot. And the stirring the pot really, it comes down to actually often one-on-one conversations that you have with people. And it's simply taking the time to listen to individuals or listen to the projects and asking them questions about, what are you doing? Why is it important? And what is it about that particular solution or intervention that actually works? And is it context specific? So if it's context specific and you want to share it with the outside world, well, then is there a particular thing that you can take from that so that it can be applied in a different situation? So what are the key insights about your work that makes it important for other people to hear or other people to know about? And I guess it's also when you take those questions and when you ask people to reflect on that individual level, you're getting them to really digest their work, to chew on it before they actually take it to the outside world. And when you get to do this at a project level, individual level, what you're doing is you're helping them to come to more compelling and interesting insights about their work. And pulling out these key insights often means that they can step out of the day-to-day programming. This is what I did. This is the name of the people who did it. This is how many people we did it with. This is the area. Those are the things that we can kind of really get bogged down when we describe our work. But constantly chewing on that, reflecting on the why and why it's important, that's really the basis of individual reflection. Well, that's in my experience, that's what I've found. I was just going to say the second part of the individual reflection is in the communication. We so often, particularly in research, we get stuck on spoken expression or written expression. So what I found is actually allowing people to have various ways of expressing themselves really helps. So giving options and really building up capacity, whether it is presenting or whether it is writing, but also bringing in film and photography and other ways of expression is also really important for stirring the pot.
I love the term they use, stirring the pot, for starters. That's and chewing on it, because I think that's where one of the things that you said, that needing to pull key insights, that's the act of chewing. And that's the act of like where you start getting to the core of things. And it's actually read through a lot in multiple sessions where people are looking at what are the questions that we actually should be asking people and how are we getting to that. So it's really interesting to hear you discuss this in this way. I'd love for you to expand a bit more on the communication level of this. So when we're communicating with multiple people with multiple agendas, how do you bridge that gap a little bit? That way you can have people be able to openly share and openly reflect without having their differences kind of, for lack of a better word, get in the way of that process. How do you facilitate that kind of open reflection in these rooms that have all of these different voices? And how do you communicate this?
So there's a term I came across a couple of years ago called working in true partnership. And I really liked this turn of phrase because I think if you really reflect on the way that you're doing something, whether you're on a leadership team or whether you're the head of a small partner, or the way that you engage with each other, if you check in as if it's actually a true partnership, you'll know whether it's actually democratic. And if a process is democratic, it means that you're looking at the different ways that power is built into the system. So I think anytime that you're doing that, you'll start to find the ways that you can reflect and people can feel safe to reflect. I don't really have time to go into the different kind of methodologies that we use, but one such example is when we come together in what I like to call an online gathering, like we are here today, is that, again, we're asking people to, have a good internet connection. We're asking them to be able to, have good bandwidth and also to have good presentation skills. And that's not always possible for everyone. So what I've tried to do is also bring in ways of people telling their stories through film. And we've done it through very low tech ways, so using mobiles to actually think about their research and record that. And then we've actually played those short mobile films in a setting like this so people can actually express themselves. So that's one way of, I guess, allowing a space to be safe for people to express it while not demanding that they be able to do it in real time. That's just a short example of that. But I think it's really taking the time and the resources, investing resources to build the capacity of people to contribute. And if you don't take the time to do that and you just expect people to do that, then we're not really working in true partnership and we're not meeting people where they are in their context.
So it's about to investing resources into making sharing and into making reflection accessible for everybody. I like the phrase true partnership as a way to lead that, because the reality of it is in these discussions, there is that power dynamic, be participant and speaker, or based on different hierarchies and statuses. It's how do we negotiate that? And I think also at your work level, that's just on this big scale with multiple moving parts. So finding those accessibility points, finding those ways to allow everybody to share is quite an interesting insight and quite a powerful tool and a very practical tool to go forward with that. So I think probably, like you said, it's something that it'd be lovely to go on forever. But if you could share one or maybe two challenges that you've come across in this process, and so that maybe some of your insights in the process of trying to bring people to a point of reflection while working with all of these many, many threads and being the holder for this.
So I've discussed the one part of the stirring the pot, which is the individual side, but really why that's important is it provides the foundation for coming together at a network level so that you can reflect there. So I guess the key thing is if you don't actually individually reflect, what happens is when you do come into these spaces is that you actually get a lot of information overload. So each of the projects, each of the individuals trying to communicate as much as possible, focusing on the day-to-day, focusing on program activities, focusing on outputs. And that's where you actually find that people start to retreat into their silos. And if you're retreating into your silos because it's just all a bit too much and it's not really, I can't see why it's relevant to the work that I'm doing, then that's where collaboration doesn't happen. So by doing the individual reflection, it means when you come together in these spaces, and it doesn't have to be online gatherings, it can also be on the, summary reports or whole network reports. It means that we have already done the chewing, we've already done the stirring, so that we can actually come together and start synthesizing. So if you've already thought about what is a key insight, and another project, or let's say sometimes I work with 60 projects at a time, everyone comes up with 60 key insights, you can start to see how they speak to each other. And that's really where reflection at a network happens. That's where collective synthesis happens. That's where collective sense making, and what it really leads to, and this is, I guess, a key part when we're talking about these large networks, is this is where we can start doing collective direction setting, collective action, and collective narrative building. So that's really the two elements of that.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. Those were incredible insights, a lot to chew on, as you've said, but also leads us in a really great way into our next speaker. So one of the things that you said that struck, and that I think is a theme that comes up in general, is the acknowledgement that there are powers in the system, and that we must acknowledge that there are systems at play that affect the way people's livelihoods and the way people operate in spaces. So with that, I would actually like to introduce our next speaker, Maria Sim. So she is a human rights and children's rights lawyer, but she'll go into her biography or her explanation a bit more now. But her section also is a bit of a tangent because she's going to be touching into different parts of that urgency that we tangle with reflection, a bit of the tension that Rosie introduced in there. But yeah, I'll let Maria, you introduce yourself better.
Thank you very much, Peter. My name is Maria Usang Asim. Just simply call me Maria. I like the way we started the meeting because what I find myself doing today also started as a result of personal reflection that I took about 16, 15 years ago. And why do I say that? Reflection calls you to also take a look at yourself. You look inwards. Who am I? What are my values? What am I adding to the world, whatever the world may be for you? So looking at those different spaces in which you have room to occupy and say, why am I here? What do I have to contribute, right? Because as individuals, no one person has a say in whether you are in existence. But the fact that you're in existence means you have a space to occupy in this world, wherever your world may be, however small or large it may be. And I say that to say the background to human rights, which is where I find myself working in, is about exploring those questions that if we say society should operate as a matter of survival of the fittest, then we will have no society in the first place to protect, right? We would have no cities to talk about. We would have nothing about sustainability to maintain or to protect or to uphold. So the very concept or the notion of human rights, it's the understanding that you would always have different categories of vulnerabilities or vulnerable groups. And their vulnerability does not take away from the fact that they are also here to occupy space. They are also here to have a voice. They are also here to have particular contributions or inputs or values that they can bring into the human society at large. So that's basically where it comes from. Now, when you narrow it down to children's rights, because I sit as a senior researcher in the Children's Rights Project at the Dalla Institute at the University of the Western Cape. When you narrow it down to children, the idea of trying to understand opportunities for reflection where children are concerned and trying to balance what the law says and how you handle the fact that children are vulnerable. First, it's the need to understand the fact that children are not mere objects of charity. If we were to do another Mentimeter, similar to how we started, and I were to tell you, what's your idea of a child? If I were to ask you, who is a child to you? I can assure you, I've done this so many times in my classes, you will find cute, innocent, wonderful, blessings, gift from God, all those nice things. But then I always ask the follow-up question. So if this child or the 7-year-old, the 8-year-old, the 10-year-old, 12-year-old, whatever the age may be, were to do something that you consider a violation of the norms of society, would you still consider that child good, cute, innocent, wonderful, a gift, a blessing, and all of those things? And now that's where the call for reflection comes in. Because then you're confronting the fact that you have a certain notion of what a child should be. So the extent of the space the child should occupy, the kind of things the child should be interested in. And it's like there's a barrier that shouldn't be crossed. And that's why we need to reflect, because that's not correct. A child does not become, you don't suddenly become, I always ask my students, you don't suddenly turn 18 and something clicks in your head. Oh, from today, I am now a superhuman, I'm now an adult. No, it's not automatic. Personhood starts from childhood, right? You begin to know yourself. What do you like? It starts from childhood. And I tell my students, many of us adults all over the world, the majority of the battles we are dealing with, whether it's mental health, psychological issues, whatever it is, a lot of them are tied to childhood trauma. But we don't take that period seriously, because it is the period where we lay the building blocks and the foundation for how we're going to negotiate the spaces we find ourselves in the future, and how we take up those spaces, and how we make contributions in those spaces, because we continue to fight demons from childhood. So the other part of that, what I want to say in relation to that is, we also must reflect on the fact that it's very easy. People say, oh, children are vulnerable. It's a very general statement. But we must know that vulnerability itself is very contextual. I could take you to a certain part of Cape Town or the larger Western Cape, and a 7-year-old in a particular neighborhood will be much more secure and safer than you, the full-grown adult who has all the means and all. Why? Within the context of that space, there are certain networks, relationships, and what have you that give the child a firmer footing, a sense of belonging in that environment that you do not have. So vulnerability is also contextual. So those are all the things we have to, reflect on. And that's why we always try to find what's the balance between what the law says and how to be sensitive to the concerns of these people as individuals within the context of whatever the situation we're talking about in our context and in our spaces. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. You had me a bit at a loss for words, I'm not gonna lie. Thank you so much for that impactful reflection on, for starters, why we need to reflect on childhood and why we need to reflect on the child and the notion of the biases we have around the child, because I think it isn't until we reach that point of reflection that we're aware of the barriers that we put in our minds of how we view children. And like you said, this is the very bare basis of how we start to build cities, how we start to build societies. We have to start thinking from that child, vulnerable person perspective. And the other really, really impactful part that you've mentioned was that we need to reflect on the context of vulnerability. And we need to reflect on the context itself, because that is where we actually start to see the underlying or the underpinning issues. It's not a one size fits all to just say, oh, simply because there are everybody within this age group, they all have similar struggles. No, like in order to be able to build this holistic society, is to actually reflect, looking at everybody, looking at the full context, looking at the broader picture. And that does start from the individual, does start from looking within and pouring out from that. So Yes, thank you for that reflection. I think the the prompt that I would then offer is, while we're grappling with this, the reality is a lot of times we are pushed to be quite urgent, or especially for looking at sustainability work, it feels like there's a time clock ticking above our heads about when we're getting to those dates where Africa's population is set to double in urban spaces, where we have climate crisis, where we're looking at all these intersectional issues that will affect human rights. So that time bomb is almost above our heads. So there's that chase and that urgency. But in order to reflect, we do need that stillness. So there's a quote by Bayo Akomolafe where he says, urgent times calls for quiet, for rest, and for respite. And I'm quite curious about, how do you deal with the entanglement of urgency when you're reflecting on the child, when you're reflecting on the present child, in order to start building policies and start thinking about policies for better futures?
Thank you. That's a good question. And I say that because the starting point is very crucial. As any parent knows, children do not have the luxury of time. Even for non-parents, if I were to ask you, what do you remember about the first 18 years of your life? You'll probably be blank for a few seconds, trying to think, okay, what happened then? Why? It flies by. So it really means that for children, we do not have the luxury of time. So if, for instance, in relation to a policy in a city, so say we need to have more play spaces for children, in our cities. If we're going to waste time debating the pros and cons and politicking about it, when we start having the discussions, perhaps the children we're targeting were 5. If we go on the way we operate, particularly in the context of African cities, the children will be 18 before we realize we've done nothing. So that's why we must always bring to the fore the fact that where children are concerned, we do not have the luxury of time. In as much as we want to take all the care necessary to make sure that the action or decisions we take impact positively on them, we must always find the balance between that and the fact that time is running out. And how do we do that? In the context of children's rights, again, back to the similarity of how we look at vulnerability. We have a principle known as the principle of the best interest of the child. Now, the problem with how people interpret this principle is people think it means one thing, but it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Similar to vulnerability, we must come down to the point where we're able to say, for this particular child, for this particular group of children, what will serve their best interest in this particular context, in this particular moment, and plan around that. Now, reflection means, in that context, means you don't come with a preconceived idea. You don't come with a predetermined course of action. You come with an open mind to investigate what are really the context or the circumstances that are concerning them in this situation, and how do we then address it in a way that touches upon their interest and protects them as the persons that they are. Now, let me give you just a quick example within the context of children and the need for alternative care. Something where we had to pause and say, look, you can never have a one-size-fits-all approach, even for children or any category of people. And in fact, I always try to say, in the context of being a woman, and then also understanding children and also dealing with gender rights, the same way they scream at us about women and their biological clock, they also scream to children about the fact that by the time you're 18, you're done. So that's why we have laws about the fact that if you're still in conflict with the law and things are going on and you're past 18, you should still be entitled to the same privacy you had before you turned 18, because nothing changes automatically just because you turn 18, right? So what do we do? Now, just to give you that particular example, in the context of children who become either orphans, in Southern Africa, we had a lot of that years ago in the early 2000s due to the HIV and tuberculosis crisis. So we have categories of children who are in need of alternative care. And this example, the real one that I always share with my students, because in that space, the push was, we don't want to put children in institutions. Whatever kind of alternative arrangement we make for them should be a family-like kind of scenario. So more or less, we're saying, if the children cannot be adopted, they should be in foster homes and something like that. So now the idea was to more or less throw away the idea of any form of institutions for children. Now, it sounded noble, it sounded wonderful, But now when you begin to practice, then you realize it actually doesn't suit everyone. So in the particular scenario, this is an 8-year-old who was a victim of abuse by a stepfather and who was living with the mother, right? When this was discovered and social workers got involved and the child was taken out of that space, in the idea of, oh, we need to place an alternative care that also looks like a home, right? Like a family, you know, the typical father, mother, children kind of idea that we think every family should look like. The child is placed in a home like that. After months of going to follow up, there was no improvement. We thought the problem was maybe this particular family isn't working. We changed for a couple of times. We had to pause and say something is not right here. It's not about the places we have taken the child to. What is the issue? Now, you see, in the child's mind, any home you take her to, and there is somebody who is a daddy, in her mind, she's 8. Somebody she calls daddy is somebody who does bad things to her. Mm-hmm. So she's not able to be comfortable anywhere we place her. So we realized we first had to deal with that trauma, right? Correct something that had been destroyed or damaged in that child. Now, while we are doing that, where does the child stay? It means that in that context, an institutional placement that doesn't have the formal or the traditional mother, father, children was the best place for that particular child. So that's just an example of how we apply the best interest principle, because that's the key to finding balance between the issue of urgency and vulnerability. Taking action for policy and bringing change. Always have to find balance, and that's the way by which we touch on it.
Thank you. I think it again kind of brings us back to this idea, this thinking that we've been unpacking, where reflection offers us enough pause, enough space to get to the specifics, and that's the key word in there, the specifics of the context. It's been coming, it seems like this is where we almost have that need for pause and that purpose for pause and the intentionality around pause. It allows us to actually start create space to ask those questions and create space to ask what is the exact problem or what is the exact solution. So thank you so much for those powerful, powerful insights. So I'll be taking us through to the third chapter of our conversation, where we kind of meld in this space of, yes, looking at reflection as this in-betweenness, but then looking at a mix of collaborative work as well as advocacy work and advocacy for rights-based work. So with that, I'm gonna introduce our third speaker, Sikle Motsa, who is a interdisciplinary researcher whose research focus tends to revolve around representation of Black and queer figures in Africa's context, in Africa's present context, but especially in their archives, and what it means for bodies to occupy space and how the space then further infers meaning. But Sikle, I'll let you carry on from there.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the reflections from the previous speakers. There's just been so much that's been quite enlightening and very insightful. Like Vida has already said, I think my work tends to be very interdisciplinary. It's really interested in questions around research, but also making or creating habitable spaces and habitable futures, and habitable not in the very linear sense of where people live, but that really looks at a very holistic, thinking around the term, right? To say like, what does it mean for people to be able to show up authentically and in their true self, as their true self, but also have their rights to dignity and integrity met. So just really trying to create a space where people are able to thrive and be their best selves. And primarily, I'm interested in questions around gender. I do tend to advocate for women, but not only women, so women and children. And I think in the South African context, there's been a lot of contestation around the fact that women are categorized alongside children and disabled people. But I think that's exactly where we need to be, not because we're minors in the eyes of the law, but because we occupy a similar place in terms of marginality, and we're marginalized by the very same structures and systems that children and disabled persons and queer people as well are marginalized by. So it's actually a way for us to foster solidarity in very uncanny ways. And I think it's not always intentional or purposeful, but gender is really just always on my mind. So even currently, my work is really looking at the gendered relations in cities and the way that spaces and urban spaces aren't able to accommodate differently gendered people. And I'm very interested in the historical reasons behind that, to say that what are the gendered processes, the gendered politics that drive, practices such as migration, who are the types of people who are most likely to be affected by certain events. Should they be climate change, political instability, violence, right? And how do those people seek recourse? And often we find that it's women. And I'll make an example of this to say that even in a place like KZN, currently there's a lot of conversation around the high rates of violence, and that conversation is obscuring the very fragile climatic conditions in KZN. So KZN is always rocked by floods, and in those floods, we find that it's predominantly women who are affected because they're more likely to live in these precarious dwellings. And it's not necessarily of their own choosing, but it's a consequence of the rural to urban migration that itself has particular historical, roots. And in the South African context, it's because of things like the dual system, where women in the rural areas are subject to customary law, and then in the urban areas, there's something that's called civil rights. So you find that women don't have security of tenure in rural places. They're precarious, and with the rising levels of unemployment, they have to make a means, and often this means moving to urban spaces. And unfortunately, they then find that even in these urban spaces, they're not accommodated for. So my work is really interested in thinking around, what do solutions, right, for marginalized people look like? What do futures that center marginalized individuals look like? And not from the top down, but from the bottom up, to say that it should be women and children who are creating these solutions. It should be women and children who are even coming up with the terms to describe their experiences.
Sure, thank you. I think I'm quite interested in the use of terminology and the way that we use terminology. But like you have described, there's a absence in this course where, because of the systems that have been set in place beforehand, women and children, and women especially, are in setups and are in living environments that compromise them. So at this point, we think about, how do we start rethinking about the setups that they are in? But for starters, who should be having those conversations? Who should be leading that conversation? Who should be at the forefront of, at the very basics, what are we calling? What is the terminology we're using to describe this? So I think in bringing the conversation to that intersection of your work, where it looks at the past to imagine better futures, what would you, if you had to call on one or two ideas or notions or propagations from reflection that you've gained from looking at archives, from looking at past absences or non-absences, or even the way we consider absence, that provoke the way we view the future and how we should be thinking about the future? So how do you engage in reflecting on these archives and on these materials of what the reality is and what was, in order to provoke better imagining for future?
Ooh, that's a very tricky question. Yeah, but I'll answer it in two parts. I'll say, firstly, it's very important to be frank and to say that this is work that I'm currently going into, and I'm in a process or in a state of reflection myself, right? To say that I'm working with under, like marginalized communities, and that requires that I take stock of my own privilege or the ways in which my positioning is different from those I'm interested in being in solidarity and being in community with, right? So it's very important to say that, okay, I'm not going to be the driver of this process. The communities most affected by these events are going to drive this process. So and that's where developing the terminology becomes very important, because I approach these communities, I approach these places with, like a particular language. So even this thing of like climate change, what does it mean for us to think about climate change, or for someone to think about climate change when their house has just been flooded and it floods every year, and the municipality doesn't say anything, So there's an opportunity, right, to create terms and concepts that reflect that experience of being unseen, of being unrecognized, that experience of feeling powerless, but still trying to make a means, but also relying on people's memories, right, of different, maybe the migration process. How did one get you? Ultimately, I'm trying to articulate that people have a vocabulary, right, that they use to express where they are in that moment. And those are the types of concepts and terms that we should be using to describe, certain experiences. And I know it might sound very vague, but I do know that when I actually begin doing this work in earnest, I will develop this concept. And I do know that these terms are going to encapsulate the political and the historical dimensions better than the English concepts that we have, because it's also important to recognize that a part of the incongruence is because as a researcher, as an academic, you tend to rely on English, but these people with whom you're dealing with, right, live their lives in isiZulu or any other native language. So that's one. And then I think it's also important for me, I'm definitely interested, like I said, in the historical aspects of it. This work actually began as an offshoot of my academic work, but it's very much in line with my social activism, if I can call it that, to recognize when there's a need to look at traditional archives, but to also recognize when people themselves are living repositories, right? When they have, once again, like the vocabulary, and they have the language, and they have the memories, and they have the means of creating narratives and knowledge in the present. So that becomes a way of dealing with the past absences, right? To say, okay, that there isn't a lot on maybe women's migratory practices, or their particular experiences of customary laws and all these other laws that disenfranchise them. But there are currently women who are doing the work and who are speaking about what it means to exist on the fringes of society, and what it means to be, largely affected by events such as climate change and political violence or political instability.
And it leads back to what Maria was even talking about listening deep.
Yeah.
And listening deep is a way for us to almost center ourselves, come back to ourselves, come back to the environment that we're in, because as much as the work fosters solidarity, like you said, part of that reflective practice is taking stock of your own privilege. That internal looking, take stock of own privilege, even as the person championing the work, is to also acknowledge your positionality within that. And I think even Rosie touched on that need to acknowledge positionality while we're doing this work, because it's important. It's needed to have that as the baseline. That way you're able to check where your own mental voice begins and ends, or your own mental biases or those barriers begin and end, and where you're actually listening to the community in front of you, the people in front of you, the memories in front of you. especially the memories in front of you, because when you're discussing this idea of working with, rather than physical archives always, is working with those intangible archives through memory. How do you create space to sit down, almost like step back and lean into a very different way of knowing? Because even as a researcher, memories might not be a common material that you make tangible. So the reflection there does still lead us into spaces and still speaks to the themes and conversations that we've been having. I think one more question I could ask you there is, how do you bring other people into this point of reflection despite having biases and prejudice and own programming? Because like you said, you have that, you occupy a bit in that social advocacy space, but then as soon as we start discussing gender rights, which means it's broader than just women, and sexuality rights, you are going to be negotiating with biases, and you're going to be negotiating with multiple layers of biases. But how do you bring people into one state of reflection, acknowledging your own biases and acknowledging that they will also come in with their own biases?
Once again, these questions. Thank you very much. I think firstly, it's to recognize that you can't necessarily bring people to a unified state of ideation. You know, people come from different places. People have different desires. People have different desire. People have different desires, basically. So what should be the goal, rather, is to work with those differences, right? And to create or to sow seeds of solidarity, but also to create an investment in a shared future, because ultimately that's what's at stake. We're trying to create a society that's accommodating, but we measure that based on how well it's able to accommodate the most marginalized. So I think this process is really about getting people to understand that the most marginalized have to drive this process, because currently society is structured in a way that privileges those who are already privileged, right? Or those who have means, or those who are privy to how certain systems work. So in such a scenario, we can't have those people who already have privilege driving the narrative or driving the conversation. And equitable, I'll make an analogy of this. I always think that I'm vegan. I've been vegan for a very long time. And often people complain that, oh no, we need to accommodate you. We need to get you this. And when they do accommodate me, they just like feel so proud. And I always think that if you had just gotten vegan snacks, if you had just gotten fruit, because everyone can eat fruit, right? Then you wouldn't have to accommodate me, right? So why do we not create societies that inherently are safe for women and children? Then everyone would be safe, as opposed to thinking that we need to create these pockets of safety within said spaces.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's, again, it links the synergies between the works and ways of working is quite beautiful there, because it comes down to, let's just start on that base level of making sure that security is there. And like you said, it's looking at things from the bottom up perspective, as opposed to this idea of, okay, now we have made a safe space. So
accommodations, yes.
Accommodation, yes. Like rather than saying, oh, we've done this, and then the pat on the back, it is, let us actually look at the foundation of how we start this. The foundation of this, how is that the most inclusive way? And how are we starting off with, this is the general, like the general itself is that base of who's the most vulnerable in that situation, who's the most marginalized in that situation. Have they been not accommodated for? Have we thought about how these spaces affect these bodies and how these spaces affect these livelihoods? Does this world itself, the way that system is structured, set up, is that baseline there? So it comes down to, again, that how we beginning conversations. And I think even reflection as a topic is about that, like, how do we start? Not necessarily the active motion, but how do we create a starting place, a return, respite, not respite, a space that we're isolated, that we're able to actually think, contemplate, and look back at the past. So thank you so much for adding to this fruitful conversation. The urge with everybody to just continue going on and on is very much there. But I understand that we've been talking for also a while, so I would love to kind of use this opportunity to maybe invite any participants or any fellow panelists to ask questions. And our Q&A, feel free to pop questions in the chat. If you want to speak, please feel free to raise your hands, or if you're one of the panelists, please feel free to unmute yourself. But yes, I'll let Mimbo lead us through the Q&A section, but feel free to take moments to think up questions and push them towards our incredible panel.
Well, thank you very much. I think the whole discussion around reflection has really brought to mind the inequalities that exist in our urban environments, and how our role really should be to amplify those voices that are not heard. I've not seen any questions yet coming up in the chat, but I'll just pose a few questions. I think my first question would be, I think to both to Rosie and to Professor Maria. I think Rosie, you touched on how, based on your experiences, working in a multidisciplinary environments and bring people to collaborate and to reflect, to sit back and reflect and bring those individual reflections together. And you looked at how also creating safe spaces, you can create, how one can create a safe space for people to be able to, and invest in resources for people to be able to reflect well. And also, I think, Maria, you really brought it down to children's rights and human rights and looking at the children's rights. Now, I'd like to just ask, I think there was an aspect of collective narrative building that Rosie spoke about. So I'd like to ask, how can we use collective narrative building in practice when co-creating with communities where we have different groups with different power dynamics and different perspectives? A lot of our urban projects now are focusing on working through co-creation with communities. So how can we use collective narrative building for them with these different groups with different power dynamics and perspectives? How can we use that collective narrative building in practice when co-creating with them? And yeah, so I'll throw that to Rosie, and Maria, you can also come in on the aspect of children if there's anything in there, while we try to see if there's any questions coming in from the audience. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I think particularly when we're working across many different projects, where often when the funding comes, usually people are already doing the work. So you get the funding, but actually we've already got our agendas. Not to say that those agendas aren't very important and valuable, but we come in silos. And the trick, or what we try to do when we create a network, is how do you bring each of these silos together into a cohesive narrative? And again, I talked about that individual stirring of the pot to bring out individual insights. The next step is then, once you've got those individual insights, how do you create a safe space that doesn't overload the projects? Because they're already, they've got a certain amount of funding, their time's already taken up. So then how do you come together that we've got time to actually come together to do those shared insights? And it's been a very steep learning curve for us to do that in a remote environment. You can spend a huge amount of money to fly people together. It's much easier in person, as we know, but the money and the cost to the environment of doing that is so great. So we've tried to just experiment and be brave in that experimentation of ways to coming together. So some collaborative tools can be useful, like Miro, or anything where you can put up sticky notes and create things. That's very useful. Really excellent organization helps. So if you say you want people to come together, then being very good with your communication, helping people with their scheduling, getting people to come together in groups so they can talk about it. And also, I guess, really like helping those people to organize in a safe way. So of course, you're always going to get a particular person who's used to speaking, who's going to put their hand up to be the organizer of the group. And then they're going to organize that group and those shared insights according to their own paradigm. So being quite, you have to be democratic, so you have to let people do it, but also, paying attention to who you know is in that group. And that's where I'm saying those are that individual discussions. If you know that person's going to overtalk, then you need to make sure you put in a space so that the voices that aren't heard can get together. And then by creating those little pockets where people can share those insights, that's where the collective narrative, it will happen if you put in the work and you put in the time, good organization, safe spaces, make use of your online tools. That's really, I guess, some of the biggest, steepest learning curves that I've had with collective narrative building.
Now, that's great to know, Rosie. And I'm just thinking about now, I think you've talked about the use of technology. What about those communities where they might not have that technology? Like, what's the best way to bring them in? I guess it's just doing that in the same way, like you talk about using the mural, but having maybe being in a safe space where they can all contribute, collectively, in a physical space. I'm sure that that can still be done even without technology, right? Yeah.
So was that a question or a comment?
Yeah, it was just more like a reflection, because I think you talked about the technology part of it, like use of mural, but we have a lot of our communities in Africa that, when you're collaborating with them, you're not doing it with technologies, like you're just right there at the ground level. So I think it's more about creating that safe space where, they can also contribute, effectively and, reflect effectively. I'm not seeing any hands up from the participants, but I'll also ask Professor Maria, I think more around, I think your experience with children in similar manner, like I've asked, that Rosie has talked about collective narrative building in practice, but how does that come up, like when you are dealing with children, and what would you think it would look like when bringing in their perspectives at that level as children or youth, or in terms of how they want their spaces to look like, how they want their spaces to, the urban spaces, the environments that they're living in look like, and how they can respond to their needs as children. So just your thoughts around that, around the collective narrative building in practice.
Thank you very much, Mimo. I was smiling because I said, usually in teaching, we say when there are no hands or questions, it either means we're very clear and everybody understood perfectly, or they were just bored and they wanted to finish. So we're going to assume it's the former.
Yeah.
But quite frankly, I think Rosie already put it quite eloquently. And in my opinion, the answer already begins with what Sitle said earlier. I actually took note of that. She said, you can never bring people to a unified state of ideation, right? Then what is the goal? You work with the different groups and the different people involved with what, and I added something, with clear objectives, and she said a shared future in mind. Why am I saying that? Because you're talking about collective narrative building. Another important thing she added, and I say this with a caution, the point is you don't want those who have privilege leading the narrative, but at the same time, it doesn't mean shutting them out of the conversation. Because it's like the proverbial story of the elephant. There are different sides that different groups are going to bring in. But bottom line is, are we clear on the objective that we want to accomplish? Are we clear on the goal? Because when we let those two things drive us, then it's easy to put aside your ego or whatever you may think your ideas are, so that if whatever your contribution is not adding anything to the objective and the goal we want to accomplish, then you drop it and it's not personal. It's just not driving us towards where we want to get to. It's as simple as that. So, but we must be able to look at it in that from that perspective and say there are different groups, like you said, and dynamics at play. But what is our objective? What kind of shared future do we want? And now, in the context of this theme, Africa, right, Rise Africa and Africa Day and all of those things, one of the questions we always need to ask ourselves, again, going back to context, in a lot of the things we do, whether it's policies, it doesn't matter where. How African are they? And by African, I don't mean African because there's another danger where we like to idealize the past, or in traditional African society, we make as if it was such a wonderful, utopic, like it was Ethiopia. I don't know where that comes from. So, but the point is, again, have we reflected? Have we thought about what we want to accomplish? Let me give you another example that we grapple with in the children's rights context. The whole matter of corporal punishment, especially in South Africa, where we handled the case just the last few years, and it was hula baloo, you don't want us to discipline our children, and or what have you, or what have you. Now, it's a matter of approach. What is the objective? What is the goal? You want discipline that results in a well-rounded individual, both now and in the future. That is the goal. Now, if whatever form of discipline, so-called discipline you are bringing is not contributing towards that goal, then you are not practicing discipline. You're guilty of abuse. So it's very simple when we look at it from that lens of what's the objective? What is the action you're bringing it? Is this contributing to the objective? If it's not, then you're not helping our cause, and you move. To wrap it up, in, again, bringing it down to the African context, because one of the debates we had with our colleagues from the West, which I've had over time and tried to explain, society is very cyclical. The same things that people may complain that they are barbaric here in Africa were happening in Europe years ago. Everything is very cyclical, but we forget. Now, I always do this exercise with my classmates, especially the older ones, or even my students. I say, look, how many of you, when you were growing up, how many siblings did you have? Maybe 7, 5, you were 9, you were 10, you were 7, you were 6, 5, and all of those things. And I said, okay. So now, my colleagues from the global West, or the global North, I usually say, how many of you had a room to yourself growing up? Almost all the hands are up. Then I turn to my colleagues from the global South. How many of you had a room to yourself growing up? And everybody burst out laughing. Maybe 1 or 2. And they say, what do you mean by a room? Now, the reason why I always make that example is this. For instance, if you go with your blindfold of how it operates where you're coming from, if a child does something wrong, right? Oh, Michael, you're naughty. Go to your room. Oh, you're grounded. Okay, fine. Now, if you do it to my children in the global South, go to the Eastern Cape and just say, go to your room. The question will be, which room? Does that child have a room? Maybe there's one room that 17 of us are sharing. So, but at the same time, that same child needs to be helped, to be groomed, to be disciplined. Then we ask ourselves, what tools do we have in this context, even within our limitations, to still produce a well-rounded, disciplined individual for now and in the future? And then we start to say, what alternatives kind of disciplines are there? Even parents know, one child, what you use to discipline one will not work for the other. Why? Again, back to what I said at the beginning, personhood starts from childhood. You are different. So the kind of tactics for discipline for child A is not going to work for child B. As a parent, your role is then to determine what kind of a child is A? How does that differ from B? And what tools do I need for dealing with each one? It's the same thing for every issue. So in summary, in a nutshell, whatever we are collectively building in the narrative space, the first thing is to define what is our goal, what is our objective, what are we trying to accomplish? So that when all the stakeholders come in, we look at all the different contributions from the lens of to what extent is it driving us towards our goal. If it is not, thank you, but respectfully, we drop it. If it is, thank you very much, and we move on, and it's not personal. It's just about getting us to that shared future and that clear objective. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very very elaborate contribution. I like how you've talked about coming to the table with a clear objective. I think that is very important from the word goal. And having that shared goal would help, bring in different perspectives that can work towards the same goal. I think with Sigle, you talked a lot about you're looking at gender in the cities and how public spaces are not able to accommodate women well, and looking at how they're negatively impacted by immigration, climate change, and the same, even that as they migrate from the rural where they may be having certain inadequacies there in terms of like the security of tenure you talked about, and coming to the urban and they experience similar kind of inequities. I think that was really profound. Now, I just wanted to ask, I think similar to just, just your reflections as well, just as we have heard from Professor Maria and from Rosie, just wanted to find out, like, you talked about, you had a question that you say, what do futures that center marginalized individuals look like? And I just wanted you to reflect on how in your work you feel the best way is to create space, how best the space can be created for these marginalized individuals to be able to reflect, and how do we help them to overcome their fears? Women and children may be in a space where they cannot really voice out that well. So how do we help them to overcome their fears amidst different power structures? It may be at the community level, it may be up against maybe institutions that are fixed, and how do we help them overcome those fears amidst these power structures and to amplify their reflective voices for action? So it's not just about them reflecting where they are, but taking it up, to that level of action. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. While I invite people to raise their hands or put in their questions in the chat if they have any.
Okay, thank you. I also have a question that I'm hoping to raise later. So I think, firstly, it's very important that you create a safe environment. And often creating this environment requires a lot from you as a facilitator or someone who's trying to lead or drive a particular process. So by that, I mean that often in these scenarios, you can't necessarily try to equip people with the language, right, that you are used to and that you use to make particular points or to drive particular systematic change. It requires that you actually become versed in the language in which people live their lives, right? And I say that purposely to say that language isn't simply a means of communicating or talking. It's a reflection of people's experiences, your possibilities. It's literally about their life worlds, right? About what's possible, what's doable, where they come from, all those things. So you need to familiarize yourself with people's languages, right? To their cultural context, what's possible. And I find that often as researchers or people who are trying to drive particular solutions, we don't want to do that. We imagine ourselves to be driving change, but we want for the people with which we're in community with to become versed quickly, even then, in the languages that we use to create systems. And it's just not practical. It's not practical and it's not fair, because also this future is about equity. So this is just to say that it requires that we stretch ourselves as people who are attempting to drive solutions and to create communal frameworks.
Great, thank you so much for that, Celia. I like how you talked about languages. I think, and the kind of terminology that you come with these ideas that do not really resonate with what the community understands about their living environments, about how to live their lives. Yeah. So I think it's very, very important to bring our language down to their level, to understand their language, to understand their expressions, which may be very different from what we idealize at the level of bring solutions to them, because I think that's why at the end of the day we find a lot of solutions that we bring to communities do not work at all, because there's that gap, in understanding what a good environment, for instance, means to them, and what it means to us at that level of bringing solutions. So that really, really is a very important point. I think Fumi has a hand up. I'll invite Fumi to just ask a question. And I see, yeah. Fumi, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mimbo. And I must say thank you very much to the panelists, Rosie, Prof. Asim, and Sile. This has been such an exciting discussion for me from different frameworks. And I think I've been popping up here in the room and so many ideas. Rosie, your last input just sort of like sparked a moment for me when you began to speak about us and how we enter into a space wanting to force the others to learn our language as against us learning their language. And I think it resonates very deeply with me as a researcher, as a practitioner. And the one thing I always say is that you are never the expert of people's spaces, and that you must enter into people's spaces and decenter yourself and let them be the expert and let them lead you. And it's the only way we can build towards the collective. Reframing how we enter into the space many times is always very important. But that brings me again to this question, and I think I'm posing this question to the three of you. I don't know if it's a question, I don't know if it's a reflection. Thinking about a counterbalance to this idea of shared goals and a sense of the collective, but also creating the space that everybody comes into the collective with their personal agendas. Even from childhood, every human has their personal agendas. And we must not victimize agendas because they're legitimate to the individual. And how do we come to the point where we talk about creating space for everyone, whereas there is still that tendency for the greater objective to erode people's personal agendas. And sometimes some of these personal agendas are from the voiceless or from the most vulnerable, to be honest. And so when you think about it, who really does set the objectives? Is it the loudest in the room? Is it the most popular in the room? Or is it those whose voices can be heard as against whose voices cannot be heard? I'm very aware of myself as a very strong feminist. I enter into a space and I tend to take over. I tend to be the loudest in the room. But there is perhaps another woman there who has come into that space with a personal agenda, legitimate also, but perhaps her agenda is better for the greater good as against my own agenda. At what point do we begin to create that counterbalance, number one, of setting collective shared goals, but yet still making room for personal agendas? And this is a provocation. There may be an answer, there may not be, but I'd like to hear all your thoughts. Thank you.
So I think we can start with Rosie. Do you have, or whoever is ready to go first, just to respond to that question?
Most of the networks that we've worked with, by the time the money gets to the individual projects in the countries, all of those agendas have been set. And that's just the nature of how funding and money flows at the moment. But I did work with one network. It was around transforming education for sustainable futures. And it was very fascinating. I'm going to pop the call to action that we developed from that, but they actually embedded in help getting the countries to fit the agenda in the funding proposal. So that's quite different. So it was a UKRI funding, and they allow, because of the principal investigator, so it really takes that visionary leader from the sort of the highest level of the research tier to really be invested in democratic processes. So as I said, I'll pop it in the chat so you can have a look at it, but they're key parts to ethical partnerships. Number one was co-create the research agenda. And that includes getting the partners to co-create the questions that you're researching. Number two, create a flat rather than a hierarchical network structure. 3, foreground local agendas and agency. 4, take a distributed asset-based view of capacity. And 5, support ongoing monitoring and evaluation based on the project's own ambitions. So it was quite fascinating how this was the reflections post the project. But I'll post that in there so people can have a look at that.
Thank you so much for that, Rosie. We'll look forward to reading that once you post it there. Any reflection based on what Funi had asked from the other speakers?
Let me just make a quick intervention. I think, like she said, there may be no answer, but because it's an ongoing conversation. One of my most memorable lecturers, she used to say, the first step of learning is unlearning what you thought you knew or what you knew, and then start to learn again. The reason why I say that is one of the things in all the spaces, whatever it is, in every context, we must become comfortable with people questioning things. One of the problems we have, especially in the context of Africa, is we see questioning status quo as inherently a problem. And that mindset is itself a problem. Because you can't say this is just how it's been and you never question why. Why must we continue doing it that way? Is it still relevant for now? If it's not, so why are we just doing it and maintaining the status quo? So I think we need to come to that place where we are comfortable with questioning the norm and questioning the status quo and not seeing that as a problem, right? Because when we do that, then it becomes an opportunity. That's another meaning of reflecting. Why do we do what we do and what are the changes? What do we need, to change the direction? Just a quick example. Earlier on, I had put it up in the book. I wanted them to share only the site of the African Union Committee on Children's Rights, because together with the number of organizations, similar to this thing, focusing on solutions, we're tired of complaining about how the governments in Africa are not doing anything. What can we do to start to change the narrative? That was the beginning of that platform. I'm beginning to take action for children in the context of Africa. And just a simple example. Last year, there was a lot of hula baloo because now there's all the noise about children's rights in the digital age. And for some reason, everything in the conversation was about how it's bad, how it's bad, how it's bad, how it's bad. So in that context, I said, so are we going to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Then I asked all the parents, how many of you during COVID discovered that your children were better at digital technologies than you? Almost every hand went up. We were all learning from our children then. So if you only say everything is bad, we started at the beginning talking about how Africa is the youngest continent. We have young people, vibrant, coming up. How are they ever going to compete and compare favorably with their peers elsewhere in the world, attain the sustainable development goals, if they are not able to utilize the emerging technologies? So we must, again, back to the objective we want to get. How do we harness the benefits of these developments while minimizing the risks and the dangers involved? And the first step is there is nothing wrong with wanting to question the status quo. It just helps us to reflect and then take better action that is relevant for our situation and our context. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Maria. Sigla, do you have anything to say in response to Funi's question around I think she talked about how, the individual agenda versus the collective goals and how we can embrace those personal agendas, especially when they're expressed or when those agendas are by the vulnerable, all of the vulnerable themselves, like the women, from your perspective.
Thank you so much, firstly, to Fumi for such a, like a complex and multi-layered question. And it really is just causing me to think critically about the fact that even this process of community building needs to be protected. So you can't just work on the premise of the assumption that everyone just wants this great and just and equitable future, or even the objective that Maria has spoken about, that people do have their personal agendas. And in fact, those personal agendas are legitimate, right? Why? Because people come from different backgrounds, they come from different experiences, and those experiences inform their wants and desires. But I think in that scenario, I always turn towards this great poet, Jessica Kemo, who has a poem about women and how they are always protected by their pack. But she says, ultimately, you need to leave a few of us behind. And that's simply just to say that there are those whose agendas will not align with the overall agenda. And even Professor Maria spoke about this to say that there are people whose agendas just unfortunately diverge dramatically or drastically from the objective. And because we're gathered here in the name of the objective, unfortunately, anything that's a distraction from that objective cannot and should not be entertained. But I think that this is the beauty of ideating or attempting to come up with solutions. That firstly, we need to pay particular attention to the objective. We need to take a lot of time to say, like, what is the objective, right? So that we don't get confused at the end and we don't allow for personal agendas to dictate the objective. And if it's a strong objective, then everyone stands to benefit. So if the objective is reached, even those people who are coming in with their personal agendas are going to be accommodated by the very objective that they stood against, or that they almost allowed their personal agendas to overcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Sigler, for that. I have a question in the chat here.
I'm so sorry, Member. I'm also so sorry to have to do this. But before we get a question from participants, just wary of the time that we are currently at. So I just wanted to first say thank you for offering the question. I will wind up doing post festival emailing out to our participants. So if you do still have your question, you'll be given an opportunity to potentially pose that to the panelists later on. But I just wanted to first take this moment to say thank you to all the panelists for this participation and for this engagement with this Q&A and for engaging with each other through this process. It was in itself, just watching you bounce off each other, very, very insightful. And in this next section of our discussion, our session, I would like to invite our storyteller, Nora Anido, to lead us in a storytelling provocation and storytelling intervention on reflection and storytelling possibilities with reflection. So Nora, I'll let you take it from here.
Hello, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. It was very interesting listening to all of you. I wanted to share a story or a poem that I had pre-written, but listening to this session, like this 1 hour session, I just had to write a whole new thing. So I've been taking notes, and maybe you can't see, but I have to write a whole new poem because I learned a lot. And maybe as Maria said, learning is unlearning and then relearning. So I've learned a lot from this session, and I hope that what I share is just a summary of everything that we have discussed today. It's a short story about reflection, and I'm going to start now. To reflect is to look back so we can move forward farther. To reflect is to stand still so we can launch farther, faster. My people have this proverb. It translates into the one who cuts the path does not know that her back is crooked. What our ancestors meant to say, to communicate in this beautifully woven words, is that she who carves the path through the farm or through the community or through the forest does not know that the path is crooked. Of course, she will not know. Of course, she will not know while her head is down, cutlass clenched in hand. Of course, not as long as she is hard working hard at carving paths, as long as she remains busy making our cities breathable, livable, optimized for community and people. Head down, brows furrowed, feverishly fixing, breath held, quicker, 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 this path, let's carve this path, quicker, never stopping to breathe. Slow down, change maker. Slow down, past carver. Slow down and see. Wax the hair off your eyeball. Wax the hair off. Wax the hair off your eyeballs. Look back and see the path you have carved. Is it crooked? Is it straight? Look how far you have come. Past carver. Look around. The head is not meant to be buried, rather plant your feet. Be still for a moment and look around at the faces of those for whom you have carved this path. See their smiles. Look at their eyes, how they soften when you make eye contact. How their lips curl, how their smiles say, thank you. We need this too. Thank you. Let us carve this path with you. Thank you. How can we help? Thank you. Path carver. Pause and look forward. It is not a taboo to pause. See how far we still have to go. See the new paths others have carved. See the wondrous ways we can make this impact. See, you do not do this work alone. Pause, path carver. Pause and sharpen your sword. Strategize and re-strategize. Take note, breathe. Resting is part of work. Vida mentioned, doesn't it seem paradoxical when we say we practice reflection, when practice means working and reflection means resting? However, isn't it so wonderfully paradoxical that pausing is in fact productive, in fact impactful, in fact working too? And so, to conclude this poem, remember, to reflect is to pause, to learn, to see the different perspectives. To reflect is to take your hand off the cutlass for a moment, to breathe, to open your eyes to see, to look back, to look around, to look forward and then look beyond, to look at yourself in honesty, to document, to sharpen your cutlass, because to reflect is to look back so you can move forward farther, to stand still so you can launch farther, faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Oh my goodness. Always leaves the room in chills. Thank you so much for the topics that we've discussed, almost capturing all of that in those few minutes. So thank you so much for that sharing. So I think I've even seen the chats, everyone saying goosebumps. Oh, I might be breaking up. Can everyone just give me a sign if you can hear me, if everything's going fine? Okay, thank you. But we are unfortunately coming to a close with the session. So while I quickly wrap up, I just want to drive everyone's eyes slowly towards the chat box. You'll see Zakia will start posting some links in there. We've got a post-session survey that we would love for you to fill in. We want to hear how you felt about the session. And we've got some more things in there that I'm going to unpack. But first, I want to just say thank you. Thank you to those who helped us hold this space. Thank you to the team in general that was helping to facilitate this session. Thank you to our panelists who gave us their time and their incredible brains and their insights and their voices and their ears for listening. Thank you to Nora for sharing impactful storytelling. Thank you for the questions that were asked and the ones that are still being asked that we'll probably review as we carry on. But yes, thank you for making the space what it was, and thank you for allowing us to settle in it. And also thank yous to our interpreters who made this space a bit more accessible and had us be able to have bilingual facilities during the session. So yes, if you have a look at the chat box, you'll see the post survey that we would love for you to fill in just to get your insights in on everything. And then we're also running a social media storm tomorrow. So RISE surrounds itself around Africa Day, and we advocate and we champion Africa Day. So this Africa Day that takes place on Saturday, in the spirit of remoteness, we'll be running a social media storm, and we invite people to look at the links that we've had on Trello and on Google Drive, share and post anything that gravitates you about your African city and that gives you that pride of being part of an African city, or create your own, share using the hashtags. Got guides all up in 3 more sessions going today. And then we've got a festival debrief that we would love for you to join on at 3 o'clock. So yes, that is it from me overall. I have a lovely rest of the festival, the rest of the remaining part of the festival. I will see those of you who join us for our festival debrief at 3 o'clock.